Yep.
All right. So good morning. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Rachel Plotnick. She's the author of Power Button, A History of Pleasure, Panic, and the Politics of Pushing. And her second book, License to Spill, when
Where dry devices meet liquid lives.
Yes, both published by MIT. It's the kind of body of work where that you really admire from afar, but more than that, you kind of get fascinated by the imagination that kind of wanders through the world this way. I don't know if she drinks Dos Equis, but to me, it's like one of the most beautiful, one of the most interesting people in the world, At Indiana University, Dr. Plotnick is a historian of technology and of culture. And I hear one of the most sought after graduate advisors in her department. Her research focuses on the study of interfaces, where she thinks about our relationship to technology, what we want from them, how we think of them, how we imagine they work, and their power over us. And by us, I mean, I think it's refers to the engineers in this room and those who are not, right? Because I think that whatever field you're from and whether you're an academic or not, I think what I find is that everybody finds a personal connection to what she talks about. Rachel Plotnick.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much to Dr. Sim for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to iSense and Nicole for organizing my visit, and Teresa Hess as well. It's lovely to have met a few of you thus far, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today. So my talk is called Durable by Design. I'll stand more here so you can see. The tamper-proof wristband as technology of the wrist. Maybe I'm not. Yep. There we go. Okay, thank you. So broadly, my work thinks about what I call kind of technologies of the hand. I'm very interested in the relationship between what we do with our hands and the devices that we use in everyday life. And that's taken kind of a variety of shapes and forms. So as Dr. Sim mentioned, my first book was called Power Button. And I started writing this book way back in about 2009. At that moment, there was kind of this question about, are we experiencing a death of the button? This was shortly after the release of the first iPhone. And people were talking about this kind of paradigm switch from buttons to touchscreens. And I was very kind of preoccupied with this question of not only where are we headed in the future, but how did we get to where we are? And so I started to think about the past and how we became a society that pushes buttons. I was really interested in what I call this idea of digital command, thinking about how people control the world and communicate in the world through a touch of the finger. And so I really looked at how this idea of the fingertip became very important, and buttons became this technology that proliferated across things like elevators and vending machines and early cameras, and lots of other technologies as well, from musical instruments and keyboards, et cetera. So I wanted to understand how buttons are as much kind of this cultural technology as much as they are this physical interface that we use in everyday life. My second book, which just came out this past April, is called License to Spill. It is based on the James Bond pun, License to Kill. And in that book, again, I was kind of really thinking about touch. Here you can see a finger smudge on a touch screen. But my focus became how we negotiate kind of mess and hygiene in everyday life with technology, whether that's dealing with smudges on our screens to figuring out how to waterproof your phone so you can take it in the shower, or going surfing or swimming with your smart device. And then what happens when accidents occur, whether that's dropping your phone in the toilet or spilling a drink on your laptop. So I'm really interested in kind of these micro experiences of everyday life and how we can understand the relationship between devices, environments, and our bodies. And so that's kind of a theme that runs throughout all of my work. So often I'm trying to think about the world in kind of strange ways and sort of poke at the taken for granted, right? These experiences that people don't necessarily talk about, but are kind of present everywhere we look. And so a third sort of technology of the hand that I've become interested in as of late is the wristband. And I guess, I joke that I'm moving from the fingertips up to the wrist. Maybe I'll be like researching elbows in a month or something. But I think the wrist is such an interesting site of technologization, I guess. And I tend to approach things thinking about them historically, culturally, but also technologically. And the wristband has sort of stood out to me because it's what James Gilmore, who's a study of wearables or scholar of wearables, thinks of as kind of this passive or administrative technology, because it doesn't have a screen the same way a smartwatch might. Often they use, if you've ever been in a hospital, with a barcode, NFC, RFID. They're using various technologies to sort of track you across space and time. But they're very sort of rudimentary in many ways. They use silicone, paper, plastic in various ways to communicate information. And I'm really struck by what happens when we begin to attach these devices to our wrists and carry them around wherever we go. And so this has prompted kind of this new strain of research that I'm working through right now in thinking about braceleting as this kind of technique that is both historical and exists in the present moment. And many people think about as kind of a future technology as well. So today I'm going to be focusing on bracelets specifically. Since you all are in Florida, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Disney Magic Band. Disney pumped about $1 billion into its project to create the My Magic Band. And I was really intrigued by the way that this is, a technology for datafication and tracking how people move through Disney parks. But also it's a technology that has a much longer history. As I said, we can trace this back to hospitals and even much earlier. And the idea behind that wristband is that your wrist is interpretable no matter where you go. It functions as a key, a credit card. It keeps track of what you purchase, how long you're waiting in line, what you have access to. And this is as much a tool of kind of entertainment as it is a sort of datafication, but it's packaged in this very pleasing format with bright colors. It's shipped to you before you actually go to the park. It's sold as kind of this add-on or perk for people who are participating in amusement. But what was also really fascinating to me is that if we think of braceleting as a kind of technique, it far exceeds any one particular domain. So here you can see immigrants who are being tracked by wristbands in Texas before they were being taken to New York by a bus, and there's a child being tracked by their wrist. These wristbands are increasingly used for inmates in prisons for inmate identification. It's not so subtly called the clincher. And the idea is that it's laminated. It comes with either a black and white or color photo, and it's becoming this kind of standard of law enforcement so that it can be used in concert with things like video image systems. And I was really intrigued by the fact that instead of having an ID badge or a card or something else that you carry or wear on your person, the idea is that this is on you at all times. So when you shower, when you sleep, no matter where you go. So there's kind of this connection between security and the wearable. This also leads then to thinking about how people experience wristbands. And I've kind of been tracking user reactions over time, particularly on social media. Here's someone who's wearing one of these at a resort or hotel who says, "I hate that hotels make you wear this kind of wristband. I'll have to stay with it for 4 more days everywhere I go." And so on the one hand, I've been thinking about this as a kind of practice and how it sort of moves across these different sites. In another domain, I'm thinking about the actual sort of materiality of these bands, how they're engineered, what they do, what they're for, but then also what the user experience is like with them and how people kind of try to negotiate wearing these things both positively and negatively. Another place where we see this moving across various cultural domains is at concerts and rallies. This was Kamala Harris's rally where people were given red and blue light up bands. If you're a Taylor Swift fan, you may have been to a concert or heard about bands that are given out there. There are lots of companies now that are doing kind of light and music synchronization where you wear a band and it'll sort of be triggered at different moments during the concert. So there's a way in which these are also promoted as something that's closely linked to identity, to one's personal politics, to the experience of participation in different phenomenons. We also see these at sporting events very commonly as well. So I was really fascinated by this kind of wide landscape of braceleting, and I'll be showing you some other examples throughout the talk today that sort of think about this as a technique that exceeds any one domain. And I'm really intrigued by how this is proliferating, I think, almost somewhat quietly and becoming more and more normalized or regular as we kind of go about our daily lives when we think about what it means to be braceleted. So here's a quick roadmap of where I'm headed. In part one, I want to talk a little bit more about these wristbands in social and historical context. Since I approach a lot of things as a historian of technology, I'm always interested in where did things come from? How did we get to where we are in the present moment? And sort of what relationship do these technologies have to social life? So I'll give you kind of a brief walkthrough there. Then I'm going to focus on this question of durability and wearability. This sort of stemmed out of my second book, License to Spill, and that I was really interested in this question of when are things fragile, when are they durable, how do people interact with things that they wear? And I also teach a class on wearable technologies. And so it's really interesting to me to think about what happens to a technology when it moves from being held or carried to being actually attached or worn on the body. So that's a really, I think, interesting question to think about is how do technologies change when they're integrated into our bodies in various ways? But yet the bracelet is also this kind of temporary, non-permanent technology that's typically not meant to be worn forever. It has this kind of time-limited impermanence to it. And then in the third part, I'm going to offer, I think, some provocations for how we might think about the design or engineering of these bracelets. What potentials are there? How can we think in maybe different ways and learn from this social and historical context? So some potential ideas for kind of application and thinking about alternative futures or speculative imaginings of what we could do with these kinds of wristbands. Do feel free to stop me if you have a question. I'm happy to chat about anything, but also chat with you at the end as well. So to give you a sense of how these wristbands sort of fit into a longer sort of history or social trajectory, I traced a lot of the things that have happened with wristbands to a history of identification. If you're on the older side, you may be familiar with these ID bands. Sometimes they'd be involved in courting or dating. You would give someone your wristband that would have your initials or your name on it. These are also used in identification for things like medical issues, you know, if you're diabetic or you have a heart condition, you have allergies, things like that. But there's a long history of identifying people with things worn around their wrists. I also connect these to concerns about surveillance and policing, since a lot of what wristbands are about is about knowing where people are in space and time and being able to monitor and track them. The ankle monitor is obviously kind of a cousin of the wristband in various ways, and especially when we get to thinking about how people use these in prisons or how they use them to track people. Like I gave the case of immigration, we can think about the handcuff and the ankle monitor as being kind of also closely related to how people think about wristbands. And then the third is this kind of authorization where I think about status. And how the wristband often becomes this kind of marker of someone's status and ability to enter or access a certain place. So to go back to that idea of the Disney My Magic Band, there's a certain status associated with being able to have a fast pass and jump ahead in line. If you've ever run in a marathon or you have backstage pass to a concert, this bracelet becomes a sort of marker of class, of status, of your ability to enter into a certain place. If you go to a club and you get a wristband put on you saying you're over 21, right? There's that kind of authorization of saying that you're allowed in a particular space. And so I see bracelets performing all of these functions, sometimes more than one of them at a time. But I'm interested in tracking sort of over time how these different relationships between these three phenomena are kind of coming together. And for me, this question of identification and classification is really interesting. How do we come to know people from what they wear on their wrists? And in order to do that, we have to create a device that is sort of durable and wearable, right? The fact that it can go on the wrist and move wherever you move, and that it will stand up to certain conditions. If we think about people wearing these at water parks or pools, for example, they have to be able to get wet. If we want people to wear them when they shower, when they sleep, they have to have this certain kind of durability. And since I'm really interested in the materiality of technologies, it intrigues me to think about what does durability mean and how does that sort of transfer to different contexts when we think about this kind of always on technology, that it's always worn and it goes wherever we go. Because I mentioned this question of wearability, something that's strongly connected to that is the idea of attachment. And so I focus a lot on how these bracelets are fastened to people, or wristbands are fastened to people. I'm going to kind of use the term bracelet and wristband interchangeably. But attachment to me seems really important because there's this moment at which the thing is put on you and then the moment at which it is taken off. These obviously work different ways with different fasteners and closures, as I'm going to show you. Sometimes these have to be cut off of people's wrists after a certain period of time. But attachment to me seems like a way of understanding sort of this twofold phenomenon. One of them is thinking about how the device is physically attached to our bodies, but then also what it means to be attached to data, to different kinds of infrastructures, to different spaces, and how you become attached to something that's even bigger than the wristband. Again, these are quite different than how we might think of smartwatches or devices that have screens, fitness trackers, et cetera, because you can't actually know what data is being collected about you. You have a number, a barcode, a chip kind of attached to you, but there's no way for you to interact with that data in any way. And so I think these are kind of fundamentally different and important in that sense, in that they don't sort of follow how we tend to think of most wearables, where you're encouraged to kind of do this self-quantification or this interaction with the screen and this kind of engagement. What I've learned, and I'm actually part of this working group called Technologies of the Hand, where there are all these different people in the group. You wouldn't think such a group exists, but there are actually a lot of people who are interested in questions of how we use our hands at different moments. So I've been working with art historians and people from all different kinds of disciplines, haptics, who are thinking about hands. And so I presented this work a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the wrist as kind of this important, if we think about on-body position, it's not quite your hand, it's not quite your arm. Often the wrist is quite visible to people. You show off things that you're wearing on your wrist, but it can also be strategically hidden. And there's quite a long history of thinking about the wrist as a body part that can be tapped for different kinds of information. And I think that's really intriguing. In Chinese medicine, if we think about the pulse, that the body is a site of knowledge, and that if you know how to read the wrist in different ways, you can gain information from it. It's quite different than Western medicine, although obviously taking one's pulse is still something that's done quite often. So the wrist becomes this site of intelligibility that you have to be able to read and understand. Obviously, wristwatches are closely connected to how we think of all kinds of wristbands. And the idea of carrying time on your wrist and sort of informationalizing the body in that particular way. I think those of us who wear a watch or take a watch off know that the way we behave when we have a watch on and we're measuring the time is very different than when we're not measuring the time. And in some of my other work, I've looked at kind of questions of gender and wristwatches and thinking about who wears watches and how that relates to different bureaucratic structures, or even, diving, swimming, sport, and watches, and thinking about what information do we need, sort of when we're going about our daily lives. And then if we think about the present moment with smartwatches, obviously this idea of the future of health is on your wrist. Really points to the wrist as a site of knowing oneself. And the implication here is that you can't know yourself without the device telling you what you need to know. So there's a way in which the technology is meant to act as a kind of arbiter or archive of information about ourselves, and that we can learn a great deal about who we are by having this device on our wrist. And again, there's kind of this implication that in order to know one's health, this is sort of a 24/7 engagement, that you need to have the device on you at all times. Not only is the wrist a site of information, as I mentioned, it's also a site of identification. And there is a really long and difficult history about thinking about how we identify people via their wrists. So these are slave bracelets, where people would be sold with bracelets on their wrists that would have different kind of costs associated with them, depending on the sort of metal that you were wearing. But it was a way to identify who was being sold, who was being bought, and how much a person's body was supposedly worth. There are also cases of ID bracelets that were worn in concentration camps where people would be given a number, and they were told to wear the bracelets at all times. If it was ever removed, essentially your life would be over because you would be unidentifiable. And even biometrics have been put on bracelets at different historical moments. We tend to think of biometrics as being a product of the digital age, but this is actually a soldier's fingerprint that was imprinted into the metal. And the idea was that you would be able to identify a soldier's body if they were found with this bracelet on them, because it would actually have their unique biometric imprinted in it. So when I think about the role of identification in wearables, there's always been this idea that we can come to know people by what they wear, and trying to create a kind of classification system of different bodies in different spaces and places and times. To give somewhat of a crude example, I believe this is from the early 1900s, and it talks about an identification bracelet. I believe that this was sort of satire, but very grim satire. If you look at the picture, it essentially shows someone sort of raking up someone's body parts. And it says, with one of these bracelets, the wearer may fall 1,000 feet or 1,000 miles, and always be certain the indestructible bracelet will preserve intact the victim's name and address, so that however mangled he may be, his people may be notified. And so this is kind of speaking to a soldier, even if a soldier's body gets completely destroyed, the body is mangled, it's in pieces, the bracelet will stay intact. So as we start to think about durability, this is a really interesting question to me, that the body is fragile and even expendable, but the device will persist, right? So there's a way in which identification remains intact, even if the body does not. This then leads us in the early 1900s as well to this kind of early panic around babies in hospitals. And I've been spending a lot of time looking at the history of hospital bracelets. And a lot of the fear there was that mothers may not be able to recognize their own baby. You wouldn't know that they were biologically related to you. There was also a lot of fear of baby snatching in hospitals, and that if you didn't keep an eye on your child or they were taken away from you, that someone could go home with the wrong baby. And so this kind of gives rise to identification of babies via different kinds of jewelry. And babies were given identification bracelets long before adults were. Adults didn't start wearing them in hospitals until about the 1960s. But it was the early 1900s that babies were first sort of tagged, if you think about it that way. Originally, what was interesting to me is that these weren't bracelets. They were actually name necklaces with beads that were put around a baby's neck. To me now, sitting in the 21st century, it seems really dangerous to think about attaching little beads on a string around a baby's neck, but times change. But there was a way in which this was handcrafted. It was made individually for each child. There were actually women's kind of philanthropic leagues that would sit there when babies were born and literally string hundreds of necklaces to give to babies as they were born. So this was kind of a craft practice more than it was something that was administrative or associated with the hospital bureaucracy. But over time, this becomes more standardized with the advent of plastic. This is a company called Presco that began selling these devices. You can see here it talks about easy positive identification, the idea that we need to be able to quickly look at someone's wrist and tell who they are. And these were recommended even more so than taking a baby's fingerprints or footprints because those could be difficult to obtain. You have a squirmy little newborn baby, but the bracelet was this method of standardization so that everyone would wear the same thing and it would positively identify someone at all times. I was really struck by this quote from 1925 talking about these bracelets where it says, babies could be handled efficiently, they could get shuffled around, they could be kept in cribs if need be, like boxes on a shoe store shelf, and identity would be kept. So I'm really intrigued by the way that bracelets have been kind of associated with the idea of inventory and inventorying people. Now we tend to call this human tagging, which speaks to a similar phenomenon, even as we might tag birds, as we're looking at migration patterns. But what does it mean to think about people as a kind of inventory that can be moved around, but yet we always know who they are? So this, I think, speaks nicely and resonantly with that example I gave of the body that's destroyed, but the identity remains intact. I think the idea of identity being kept is really intriguing in the way that it sort of moves with the body no matter where it goes. And again, thinking back to that idea of attachment seems really important here, in that the bracelet is always attached. There are, of course, always problems when we think about identifying and attaching people in this particular way. And one thing that we know about identification is that it also establishes difference. So there's a way in which we say, if you are identified this way, it means you are different than this other group that is identified this way. So there have been a number of cases across history about using bracelets as a way to identify people that jeopardizes their safety or that's dehumanizing. This was a case from 1999 from Daytona Beach, Florida, where a Black college reunion week was affected because these students were staying at a hotel and they were all asked to wear orange wristbands because they were Black. With support from the NAACP, they then actually sued the hotel and won because they were being marked in this particular way, they said, which violated their civil rights. This has also been done in jail where people who are LGBTQ have been tagged, and jails will often say it's for the prisoner's safety so that people know who they are. But the converse tends to be true, which is that as soon as you draw attention to someone's sexual identity, it actually makes them much more unsafe. And people do not want to wear these things because it makes visible something that may otherwise be invisible. There's also a history of the government using these identification bracelets for migrants. And what was really intriguing me here is that the technology is actually used by veterinarians. Originally, I mentioned sort of migrating birds. It says the bracelet consisted of a hard plastic wristband, much like a wristwatch, fashioned to the migrant's wrist with rivets. The bracelet contained a small chip the size of a the size of a grain of rice and amplifying copper coil. The chip is a passive radio frequency responder. I think it's really critical when we're thinking about these wristbands. We want to pay attention to not only what is possible, but also the ways in which they call attention to different kinds of identity and who is made to feel different, who is made to feel safe or unsafe based on who wears them and who doesn't. So let's jump gears a little bit and talk about this question of durability and wearability. As you can see, we have children here in the pool getting their Wyndham bands wet. And they're very happy to do so. They're not worried about it. They're part of the special club. The way that these wristbands are often made is that they're attached through locks and what is purported to be kind of unbreakable material. So if you're familiar with Tyvek, which is a DuPont material, they also put this on the side of houses. It's used for a lot of medical products in hospitals. This comes from their website. The Tyvek is extremely light. It's resistant to stretching and tearing. It's waterproof, breathable, and very comfortable to wear. But the DuPont also focuses on this idea of security. Once the band is secured to the wrist, strategically placed security cuts prevent it from being removed without breaking or showing clear signs of tampering. And this is very critical to the idea of wristbands in that once they're put on you, the idea is that they're not taken off until you're done with that engagement. So there's this question of attachment and security through particular kinds of materials, which becomes very important for how the wristband acts, I think, both technologically, but also culturally. Here is a website from a music festival in North Carolina, which instructs people how to engage with their wristbands. Do not put it on until the day of the event. It's designed to automatically tighten and won't be able to be removed, right? So there's the sense that once you put it on, you can't take it off. We know you're excited. Don't put it on yet. Wait until you're in Charlotte before you put on those wristbands. So there's an interesting temporality to this in which the wristband does not take effect until you're physically in this place at this particular moment in time. And so it becomes tied to the body for just for that particular event or instance. And then it's designed to be removed after that time. I looked at a lot of sort of literature about locking. Again, here's the clincher, which is the inmate wristband. They have a video where they show about how this closes and locks with a snap. These are different kinds of fasteners that can be used so that it won't be removed. And, you know, I think there's different rhetoric depending on the kind of domain that you're looking at. So the clincher is a wide wristband. It's laminated. A tighter seal keeps water from penetrating and delaminating it over time. Our busy jailers now spend much less time rebanding inmates, saving time and money. So durability becomes this form of security in that the more durable it is, the longer it can be worn, the less people need to engage with having to remove it or replace it. And so I, want to ask questions about what it means to encourage this kind of durability in these different situations, and who is harmed or affected, potentially by having to wear these wristbands. As I mentioned before, there's the idea of maximum security with the idea of the wristband because it is worn, right? And we can apply this to a lot of different technologies. What happens when we move it from something that isn't worn to something that's wearable? That the wearable is meant to be on one's body at all times. And so that changes the nature of the interaction and the engagement with that particular technology. Here's another instance that's a little bit different. This is for memory care. And actually the creators of this care band were former graduates of IU, where I'm a professor. The idea here being that people who have dementia or Alzheimer's or other memory issues wear these bands so that they can't wander off the property and people know where they are at all times. Again, you can see the idea of the two-handed locking buckle, meaning it has to be operated by two hands so you cannot remove it from yourself. It's flexible. It can be attached to any watch band. And here you can see the patent of securing an article to a person. One of the problems with this, though, however, is that a lot of people do not like wearing these bands, as I'll talk about in a moment, that it feels very constraining. It feels as though their rights are being taken away. And a lot of people don't want to be tracked. And as soon as you've gone and attached a device that is locked on a person, it changes the nature of the relationship that they have to that device because they physically cannot remove it. So when we think about this question of durability and what it means to make something tamper-proof, I'm really fascinated by the ways in which this is being framed as something that is a privilege. Like, hey, you get to go do this special thing and now you get to wear a wristband. And on the other hand, it's used for bodies that are perceived as vulnerable, whether that's the soldier at war, the baby who was just born in the hospital, the person with memory issues who can't take care of themselves. And so I think there's an interesting way in which this technology is being pitched both as a privilege and as a way to mitigate against vulnerability. So if we think of the VIP wristband, this is from wristbands.com, they talk about it becoming a mini billboard so that people know, oh, I'm at Club Wyndham, right? Or I'm at Disney. It's a way to sort of establish status. And that it even becomes a keepsake. The idea is that you will hang on to this band even once you're no longer doing that activity. And it becomes sort of a point of nostalgia or something that you can cherish and enjoy once you're no longer wearing it. But then on the other hand, it's also very much associated with safety, security, and panic, and the fact that we need to be able to track people because otherwise they are unsafe. This is a kid wristband, the perfect blend of safety and fun. It's so jolly. A simple tap or scan of the wristband takes anyone with a smartphone to a digital profile created with your information. Rest assured that in the event your child becomes lost, reuniting is a tap away. And I've talked a lot to my students about this, because they have really normalized a kind of tracking culture. They use these Find Your Friends apps. Everyone tracks everyone. Everyone knows where everyone is all the time. Many parents begin tracking their children from a young age. And on the one hand, it makes us feel safer, and that seems like a positive thing. But on the other hand, I ask, well, why do you need to be tracked in the first place, right? And so it implies that the world is just a fundamentally unsafe place all the time. And particularly for female students that I talk with, this seems like a much bigger issue than it is typically is for male students. And so I think it speaks to kind of this culture of normalizing tracking and who we're asking to be tracked and how we perceive certain populations as vulnerable or not. So as we start to ask questions about what it means for a technology to be tamper-proof or what it means to be durable, then I think it's really important to ask these broader questions about how we think about security in society. I was struck by this quote that insecurity is no longer a matter for the judicial apparatus alone, right? This isn't just about police or the courts or things like that, but also for schools, football clubs, housing corporations, hospitals, care and welfare institutions, job agencies, shopkeeper associations, insurers, energy suppliers, and citizens. The fact that when we think about what it means to feel insecure, that all of us now participate in a culture of trying to feel more secure all the time, and literally securing a wristband around people becomes this kind of mechanism for creating securitization. And the argument being made here is that we all become participants in this sort of security culture where anyone feels that anything can happen at any time, and we all have to be sort of made wearably trackable. Then this leads me to think that durability has this kind of paradox. On the one hand, it seems positive because it encourages us to wear things that won't break, that won't fail, that are, more comfortable, that can go with us wherever we go. But it also then facilitates this kind of 24/7 surveillance and identification, and it sells it in a way that is very pleasing, right? Oh, don't you want to wear this band? Isn't it colorful and fun? Isn't it going to give you access to all these things that you want? And so as we begin to use wristbands in all these different contexts, it makes me start to wonder about what the implications are for building something that is so kind of durable. When we look at user experiences, as I mentioned before, a lot of people don't enjoy wearing these. They try to figure out how to get them off, and often they'll try to figure out how to remove them without breaking them. So you'll see a lot of content online about how to hack these, how to loosen them, how to remove them without cutting them, how to disguise or hide them. So they don't always tend to be kind of popular, even though they're sold as something that people are supposed to want. People talk about, for example, when they're on vacation, that if you go off property and you're wearing one of these very colorful, very obvious wristbands, that people will immediately track you as a tourist. And then you're vulnerable for things like getting targeted because you're not part of that culture, part of that population. So people will often feel frustrated that they have no ability to remove these devices. This comes from a hospital where they talk about patients who don't like wearing them. As it says here, the wristband always makes you feel that you are sick, that you are a patient. They're especially annoying for children, where the pediatrician says that kids, especially younger ones, hate it. Because I think most of us can say that no one wants to wear anything against their will or be made to feel like you have no choice but to wear something, right? Science also tells us that they're really, really gross. Some people like to leave these on the positive side, people like to leave these on long after a concert or marathon has expired. But basically they accumulate lots of disgusting stuff from being worn on the body for a long period of time. It is really kind of gross. Um, but I do want to point out the fact that these can also have personal meaning, right? Like, why do people keep these wristbands on for long periods of time? Sometimes they connote important life milestones. They can become a kind of archive of what someone has been through. This was a person going through breast cancer treatment who saved every bracelet that was ever put on them for a year and a half. And they were trying to, they talk about it as this reminder that I can do hard things, right? So I don't think, that these are inherently evil technology by any stretch. And in fact, they can become these kind of personal mementos, but we want to think about how they're connected to these broader infrastructures, to these broader histories and contexts, and what they mean in different situations and to different people. And I think one of the first steps is to start asking those questions about what they do mean to people in different scenarios. So I want to spend the last bit of my time here kind of thinking about what implications could be for design and engineering, and thinking about how we might play around with these wristbands, how we might design for the future or think more imaginatively about their possibilities. And I want to focus on 4 areas. So one is that kind of paradox of durability that I've talked about. What does it mean to make something durable? What are the implications of durability? 2 is to think a little bit more deeply about this question of unremovability. What happens when we ask people to wear things that they can't take off? 3 is to kind of poke more into the history of identification and difference and think about who is asked to wear these bands and under what situations. And then the last is to think about just how it feels to be scanned, right? My kids love when we go to the grocery store to do self-checkout. They love to, scan the cereal box, and it's like a really fun experience, but it's different when it's your own body that's being scanned. And so I think that that's something important to attend to as well. So this first one, the paradox of durability, is something that I've wrestled with a lot, right? Because I've often advocated in my work that fragility is problematic, that people break their devices really easily, that we have to have expensive insurance policies, that when things break, it's often individual consumers who are responsible, not companies. And so there needs to be kind of better repairability and better durability of the technologies that we use in our daily lives. But the paradox of that, I think, is that, as I mentioned, the more durable you make something, the more you encourage it to be always on, right? And so I think when we start to say, okay, now this thing is so durable that it can be worn when you shower and when you sleep and everywhere you go, what is the impact of that durability? What are we asking people to do? We saw this a lot, I think, during the COVID pandemic when laptops, like companies like Dell started making laptops spill-proof, and they said, now kids, you can do your homework while you're eating lunch, and now you can take this with you to the bathroom. And we're beginning to ask kids to work on their devices all the time because now they could go to all these different places where previously a spill might have broken the device. The second is this kind of politics of unremovability. I think that safety and security obviously are real concerns, and especially when we're dealing with crowd control or large bodies of people, when we're trying to move people from place to place, we do have to think about the safety and security implications of that. But we should always be kind of weighing those implications against people's sense of agency and autonomy. So thinking about what kind of harms we might do to people when we ask them to be tagged and when we put devices on them that can't be removed, right? And I think while the fastener and the lock is perceived as a really positive thing because it stays always on, we want to ask about what are technologies that are unremovable and what are kind of the consequences of building things that can't be taken off. As I mentioned, I think there's a long history of identification and difference that's really important to pay attention to. And people who are designing wearables, I think, need to spend some time kind of grappling with who is asked to wear these bands and under what conditions. And when we sort of present them as either this VIP status symbol or as this way to mark people who are vulnerable, in both cases, I think that could be harmful to the people who are wearing them because it either makes something that's desired or it tells you that you need to be careful because some harm is going to come to you. And so I think thinking in more nuanced ways about these histories is really important. And then last, I think there just needs to be more attention to the user experience, as I said, of being scanned. As we talk about babies being shuffled around in boxes on a shelf, or we think about being tagged like birds, we think about the implications of human tagging. How does that sort of affect how we think about people in society, how we begin to inventory people? What are the potential risks of that? How does sort of scanning and tracking become normalized? I think it already has in many ways, but the wristband sort of takes it to another level where you're actively kind of wearing this method of scanning on your wrist. And because you don't really know what's contained in these bands, you're being scanned without any kind of transparency about what data is held there, who's getting access to it, what will be done with it after it leaves your wrist, et cetera. Finally, I just like to kind of offer a provocation about how we might think more creatively about our risks and how could the risk potentially serve as kind of a site for new and interesting ways to engage and interact with them, or even for being kind of more playful with them. This is called the Wemo. It's a Japanese technology, and essentially it's a slap bracelet that you wear on your wrist, but you can write on and leave yourself memos. And I think this is very intriguing because we all often write on our hands or want to remember things that we forget. But it takes the wristband and turns it into this kind of analog technology where you can physically engage with it, where you can write and erase notes at various times. And so it makes something that the person who's wearing it has some control over, and it's also changeable over time. As I was speaking of history, I think friendship bracelets are also interesting to think about. And if we think back to the history of ID bracelets for hospitals, how might we make them more personal, more idiosyncratic, or especially if kids or people have to wear them who don't want to wear them? Are there ways that we can redesign to promote people's kind of creativity, feeling of being able to wear these bands in a way that makes them feel positive about that engagement? And then we can also think about creative ways to engage with wearable technology. This bracelet, for example, is meant to allow you to put away your phone so that it will just let you know if you have a text message or an important message. It'll glow or use some kind of haptic feedback to tell you. But the idea is that it actually helps you to disconnect more from your phone. Many people that I talk to feel like they're over-connected to their screens. They want more breaks. They feel like they don't want this 24/7 connection. And so I'm intrigued by the idea of a wearable that would potentially allow you to disconnect better. So these are all just ideas that were coming to me as I'm starting to think about, can we imagine more creative ways to engage with wristbands beyond the possibilities that are available to us at the moment? And that is where I'll stop, but I would love to hear your comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Regards to um, wristbands as tools of surveillance and control, has there been like another layer of panic of how those signals can be hacked? So for example, like if you're issued one by Disney, for example, I don't think you generally have a problem with Disney having information, right?
Yeah.
Is there any like right? I mean, you assume that they do, right? But is there kind of a second layer of fear about who else can access?
Yeah, I think that definitely has come up in the literature. I think a lot of these, because they use near field communication or they only use barcodes, they're really meant to only be kind of for that small engagement within a small space and time. So often it's not as great of a concern as maybe something that has more digital data encoded with it. But I have seen some concerns about that in terms of cybersecurity. And I do think we have to ask questions as we're putting more data onto these, like if it becomes your key, your credit card, it's holding more and more information, then I think the risk of hacking definitely increases. Yeah.
Especially when you consider children tracking this way.
Yeah.
Deeply vulnerable.
Yeah.
Any kind of legislative oversight to protect children's data in this regard.
Yeah. 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 There's a really interesting article by James Gilmore on children and tagging. And it's amazing how large of a movement that is to tag children. And they're often put in these very fun packages so that it's a watch, it's a fun bracelet, but I think that really the aesthetics of those designs often obscure the fact that they're datafying, in particular ways. And so that question of third-party access or who has control to the data is a big question.
This is, sorry, no, please. Really fascinating. I thought about some of the things in between that you might have that you've thought about that were kind of transitory. I think about the balance bracelet, the power bracelet. This bracelet's supposed to make you more balanced. And I thought about how interesting it is as a kind of semi-technology that got us to this kind of more real.
Yeah.
But my question is really this discourse of tampering, right? That's seemingly nefarious, but also framed in this positive light. Can you talk about how organizations present tampering as this kind of, because you hear tampering, that means you're locked up. You can't necessarily,
Yeah.
you're breaking the rules of the device. So can you talk about how that's sold as a kind of positive of this kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. To your first point, I will just say that there are so many histories of interesting bracelets that I've been trying to probe more. Like, there are sex bracelets, like there are all different kinds of like magic and handcuffs, Houdini. Like we could go on. Live strong, right? I mean, it's a big history, so there's a lot to probe there. To your second question, I think that's what's really interesting about the tampering discourse is that it's posited as it's for your own safety, right? And so, especially in the case of vulnerability, I think if you talk about someone with memory issues, well, it's for your own good, right? Like there's a kind of paternalistic logic to it. I think that's like you might wander off and we won't know where you are, so this is for your own safety. In the case of an inmate, you're already locked up anyway, right? Now we're giving you another lock that now your information is attached to you. In hospitals, a lot of parents do have panics when babies are first born, like, oh my gosh, something's going to happen to my baby. Even though this is, the 1% of 1% of, I really think it is an unfounded moral panic, but it's amazing how much more hospitals have become securitized over time. And if you read, forums online, parents will say, oh, I want them to attach this to my baby. I don't want anything to happen, And I think this is part of a broader movement towards securitization in society in general, where people want to make trade-offs so that they feel safe, right? I was just talking to my student the other day when we talked about tracking, and he said, well, I don't mind the school monitoring my email or sort of watching me on cameras when I'm walking, because what if there's a school shooting, right? We want to know who did it. And so I think especially younger generations have become socialized in a way to feel that the world is unsafe. And so these measures, against tampering is something that's a positive. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I know that thank you very much. Super interesting talk. I know that in your other work, you've looked at cell phones and probably related to mobile devices.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the tracking question in particular. So you've raised some concerns about the potential to track based on this device, not just the potential, the intent to track based on risk-formed devices. When I think about so we track our children, not with, and our children are old and we track them. And it's not wrist, it's the phone. And I guess when I think about tracking and I think about privacy and safety, I feel like the phone swamps all of these concerns. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. My sense is that what's intriguing to me about wristbands is they're not nearly as pervasive as phones are, but they're sort of being posited as the next move to get away from our phones. The argument is made, okay, well, now you don't need to carry around your phone in a theme park, or schools are prohibiting students from using their phones. Now, if we just put wristbands on everyone, we still have that kind of tracking capacity and we don't need the phone anymore. And so in some ways, this is kind of me thinking ahead, like where will we be at in 5, 10, 20 years? I see the potential that wearables are kind of the next step in sort of the datafication of the body. I do think you're absolutely right that right now the phone is the site of tracking, right? But with your phone, you have the potential to leave it behind. You have the potential to lose it. You have the potential to not have it on your person, whether by choice or by accident. Whereas because of this attachment, the idea is that you can't be without it. And so I'm kind of intrigued in the difference in kind when we start to think about the implications of that. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, have you seen the near field fingernails?
No.
Yeah, so they're near field chips that can be, it's a thin, it's made out of the same kind of flexible circuit material that they use for circuits on bandages. And you can buy them commercially at small scales, I assume, and then they can be, turns out I don't know very much about fingernails, but you can, so that's a different thing, but you get that, which is pretty cool. But the near field chips, you can put them on your fingernails and then you can seal them on your nail with just regular old nail polish. And you can use them for all sorts of interesting things.
That's yeah. And I think that all of these technologies have potential, and my old point that I go back to over and over again, Melvin Kranzberg, who is a historian of technology, said technologies are neither good nor bad, nor are they neutral, right? And so I think that is kind of where I fall in saying that I don't think necessarily any technology is inherently anti-democratic or fundamentally unusable, right? But I think we want to kind of probe context and start to pay attention to when these are used and, you know, in what situation. I don't even think tracking, you know, my kids are getting older. I don't think tracking your child is necessarily an inherently bad thing to do. But I think about those of us who are older who didn't get tracked everywhere we went and how different it is to live a life where you are always tracked versus when you aren't. And what sorts of messages does that give our children about trust, safety, risk, right? I think that there's an inherent idea that you're like a piece of cargo that has to be protected wherever you go, or we don't trust you to behave safely on your own, you know, something.
Yeah. So carrying on that, Palm Beach County now in the public schools has started tracking even when kids use the bathroom. So you have to, with your cell phone, scan the QR code in the teacher's room. Every teacher has their own. You get 10 minutes and it tracks you. You have to scan when you get into the bathroom so it knows which bathroom you're going. And we get an email and a text message.
Every time your child uses the bathroom.
Every single time.
Wow.
So that's putting all of this together now. My question for you is, I understand there's two customers in this, right? There's the school and then there's the children. Well, three if you include the parents.
The parents,
Parents aren't going to be wearing a wristband or carrying their phone. So in terms of the event happening, there's the two. How do you balance, or how would you think about balancing it as a designer engineer, the school needs, the child's needs, because what are you going to do? Give them a wristband they can't take off for the entire school year?
Yeah.
Or one that they pick up every day when they walk into the school after they've gone through the metal detectors? How would you see something like this evolving? Time, because to me the natural direction would actually be the rail.
Yeah. So this may be somewhat of an unpopular answer in a room full of engineers, but when I'm talking to people, I always say, you know, we have to be careful about how we're using technology to solve social problems, right? And I think the question is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Is it kids goofing around in the bathroom? Is it fear of a school shooter? And those are social problems, right? That could be handled in a variety of ways. Right now, the way that school is choosing to handle those problems is through technological solutions. But my argument would be that tracking isn't actually necessarily solving those problems, or if it is, it's coming at a great cost, right? And I think even the cognitive load of getting text messages about your child using the bathroom, like nobody needs to be dealing with it. I already get so many messages from my kids' school about like, this thing happened today. You don't need to be worried about it at all, but we're telling you, you know. And so I think that kind of like, where is the line on transparency? And I think we have to ask questions about what are genuine safety situations versus what are imagined safety situations, right? Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a perfect anser.
No, I don't think we as a society have one yet. I appreciate, clearly I'm not the engineer in the room, but from the business perspective, you know, what is something that's going to really make a difference, right? There's a little evolutionary change. We make them more colorful. People want to keep them on, stuff like that.
Right.
Maybe we get some kind of antibacterial ointment or something that we could rub on them all the time, and that gets sold too. But what is really a solution for this that's going to make everyone happy?
I will say that, you know, if we're just strictly thinking along design and engineering, one thing that I've talked to my students about a lot, and I asked them to design their own wearables at the end of the semester. A lot of them were really interested in making this more discreet. So, you know, they were really interested in like, what if it's some kind of bandage or something that you can wear in disguise behind your clothing? What if it's something that isn't conspicuous, right? And there are implications to that too. Like what happens then when it's not obvious that we're wearing a tracking device or we're being tracked. But I do think the conspicuousness is part of the stigma associated with these. And so if I were just speaking about it from a design perspective, I would say that making them more benign, that they could be worn in a variety of places, that they're not obvious, would be a step, maybe. Yeah.
I just started like, you know, when you mentioned the idea of whether technologies are inherently democratic or non-democratic, like the wristband itself, it's not democratic, right? Because power lies, not because it's on the periphery, but power seems to me to lie in the central location where information is collected or processed, but that's not where the wristband, right? So to me, like, you know, unless, depending on what you consider or define as the technology, the wristband itself, if only that is the technology, then it's non-democratic to me.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's an interesting debate, you know, I think if we go back to Langdon Winter, he talks about the nuclear bomb as being fundamentally anti-democratic, right? Like, are there certain technologies that no matter what you would do with them, they're not democratic, right? I don't know, you know, I think wearing something around your wrist maybe isn't inherently undemocratic, but I think it's the way in which it's embedded in particular contexts. But there's always power at work, right? There's never not power at work. Even if we think about friendship bracelets, who you give the bracelet to, who gets one, who doesn't, right? There's like the sense of the in-group and the out-group and who's cool and who isn't. The Live Strong bracelet is about, you know, showing your allegiance to a particular cause or group of people. So there's always power. But I think that deterministic question of, is it inherently anti-democratic? I have a little more trouble with that. Yeah. Yeah.
You didn't really thought about it. I hear securitization, and I think data vulnerability. Can you talk a little bit about the role data plays in all this? Because I'm thinking about, like, right, school, who protects that data,
Yeah.
how long does that data? Like, I think there's so many questions of vulnerability. When you think about the phone, I think about the data that's able to be collected is a little less invasive than watching me sleep versus knowing when I'm running versus knowing when I'm right. And
Yeah.
being able to track biomedical data becomes an even more invasive sort of technology that the risk affords. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that really is the challenging part for the user or wearer, because you really don't have any idea what's behind the band, right? I mean, it's a completely opaque, impenetrable sort of technology. And we could argue with smartwatches or other tracking devices too. They do things to make it unclear what's actually being collected versus not. So I wouldn't argue that it's maybe a difference of degree. But I think because you wear this thing around your wrist with no sense of what's being scanned or tracked, how long it's kept, who has access to it, that makes it even more difficult to critique. I think the way these technologies are often sold is to say, well, this is only about this limited time engagement, this event, right? Like, we only care about you while you're running this marathon, or we only care about you while you're at the pool. Your data doesn't matter to us after that point. But when we think about the longevity of data, third-party purchasers, right, it's really difficult to be able to know what is that path that data is taking beyond that limited engagement. You know, in some ways, I think, to Jason's question about smartphones, when we give away our data to social media platforms or to phone companies or wherever, we know it's out there in the ether in perpetuity. But there's a way in this, again, I think because of the temporality of it, it feels more benign, because it's like, oh, well, it's just while I'm at the concert, you know, but we don't have a sense of if that's actually true.
Yeah, I think about the sort of, you know, simplistic wristband is having more of a veneer with that regard, right? That the Disney is it's just a band and let you in. It's not actually collecting data and tracking you throughout this space.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes really dubious in a lot of ways in regards to that kind of massive.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think that question of benignness is so interesting to think about. Like, right now with AI, everyone's like, is it ethical? Is it not? When is it ethical? When is it not? And there's a lot of just visibility around the politics and ethics of that technology. But to me, this is sort of insidious in a different way, because it does seem so banal, you know. I mean, you go into the hospital to get blood work and it's like, oh, put out your wrist, you know, and you just do it. And again, I'm not saying hospitals are inherently nefarious, and they do have to find ways to standardize, but even hospitals have struggled. There's so many different color-coded wristbands now. They get confused. They can put the wrong wristband on the wrong person. So it's far from a perfect system, I think, even when we think about the kind of the everyday.
So I went to Disney World a couple of years ago, and I was the person who didn't want the wristband and had to go through, fill out a form, sign a paper, see my picture in order to get in the park, because I wasn't willing to wear the wristband.
Yeah.
So it's like this entire process unfolded whereby I was breaking some kind of cultural mold by not just saying accept my wrist and take it and try it.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. There's a really brilliant news article called The Tyranny of Convenience. And it really talks about how so many technologies have been created to increase convenience at the expense of all these other things. And we want things to be easy, right? And I think the easier we make things, the more trade-offs we have to make to do that. So, yeah. My pastime, I think I am.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for the questions.